Okay, so there was a lot that's contained in that. Some of it was reflected in some of the discussion this morning. I think one of the things that people were wondering about is what do you do with disrespectful youth? But before we begin with kind of taking it apart, what did Kevin want? He wanted praise. He wanted Mr. Collins to say, good job. What did he give him? Challenge? Okay. Yes. What else? He mentored him. He gave him time. He gave him guidance. Did he ever praise him during any part of that? Okay. And at one point, when Kevin is very, very disappointed that Mr. Collins can't continue the lessons with him, he says to him, I thought you were my friend. How did he respond? I'm your teacher. What did that feel like when you heard it? If you were Kevin, how would that be? That would be hurtful? That would be very painful to hear. It'd be harsh. Okay. How did it end? What was the very, very last line in the episode? Oh, he didn't say thank you. Good job. The very thing that he wanted to hear at the beginning. And so when we look at that and we think about it within the context of servant, I think there are many, many junctures within that role, within that ministry, where it would be easy to give what is being pulled for, to say good job, to give the praise that's being asked for. What's much more difficult to do is to give presence, to be present to the person in the way that that person needs, not necessarily in the way that that person wants. There's a very big difference between need and want. One of the golden rules of all the major religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, all of them have one golden rule in common. Treat others as you would treat yourself. The wording is a little bit different in each of those faith traditions, but it's essentially the same rule. When we think about that, treat others as you would want to be treated. One of the errors that we can make very easily is to treat others the way we want to be treated at the particular point we happen to find ourselves in life, not necessarily the point that the other person is in. Okay? And that's really critical when you're dealing with youth. When you're dealing with a youth, if you were to treat the youth in the way that you would like to be treated, you need to put yourself back into that particular age. You need to think and to experience and to assess from that vantage point. And ultimately, you need to focus on what is needed, not what is wanted, because they're not the same. And that's essentially what Mr. Collins was able to do in that segment. What Kevin needed was to be able to have faith in himself, to be able to trust himself, to be able to have confidence in his own abilities. And it's not because, again, what the movie or the segment, I think, has many, many layers to it, okay? Sometimes we can make the conclusion, draw the conclusion that, gee, you know, he's very needy. And he must be needy because he's not getting that at home. But you saw in the one scene, he was sitting at his desk. His father comes up, he's standing at the door. He says, "What's going on, sport?" Another quiz? Yeah. I got a C. Oh, nothing to be ashamed of there, he said, the father said. The father didn't criticize him. He didn't say, gee, a C, why didn't you get a B, or why didn't you get an A? He affirmed him. So Kevin was getting affirmation. So it's not that he was lacking that. What he was lacking was the confidence in his own capacity to learn and to grow. And that's what Mr. Collins was able to discern. That's what he recognized, and that's what he offered him. Not the praise that he wanted, but the capacity to be able to be confident and to believe in himself. That's what he needed. In the role of servant, there is always an inherent imbalance of power. You always carry a great deal of power, and we saw that in the segment. Mr. Collins had a lot of power. A little bit of praise from him would have been huge for Kevin. And likewise, in your role, you carry a great deal of influence and a great deal of power. And it's important to be aware of that. It's important to acknowledge and to take ownership of that power. When we have power that goes unacknowledged, when we have an imbalance in status that goes unacknowledged, if we want to always think of ourselves as being on an equal footing with the people that we're serving, that can be a very dangerous thing. To disempower yourself in that way can lead to a careless exercise of power. Okay? What I'm going to finish with in this segment, before we go on to the next, is ethical principles for servants, and there are 4 of them. The first is the principle of beneficence, or non-malfeasance. In other words, do good and don't do harm. When we serve, we're there to promote the welfare and the safety of the young person, and we're to refrain from any action that may cause harm. That really requires knowing what your power is. Again, it would not have necessarily looked like harm if Mr. Collins would have simply said, good job. You know, everybody would look at that and say, oh, he did a nice thing. He affirmed the kid, and the kid wanted to be affirmed. But that would have robbed him of that opportunity to develop his own sense of competence, his own sense of confidence. And so we need to be aware of the complexity of what it is that is before us. So a servant's responsibility is to take action that is to promote the welfare of the young person. Now, although that's obvious, that responsibility can be very easily compromised. Sometimes we can impose too narrow of a perspective. We can give advice that we wish we would have been given, or give praise that we wish we would have been given, when in fact that's not really what's called for. That's not really what's needed in that particular instance. Sometimes we struggle with our own capacity to allow for the doubts of the other. A youth comes to you, they have doubt. Maybe they're questioning whether God exists. Maybe they're questioning whether the church is relevant in their life. There's all sorts of doubts that people go through as part of their faith development. At one point, one of my daughters said to me, you know, I'm not sure I believe in God. And my wife was quick to want to kind of challenge that. From my perspective, I saw that as a moment of maturity, in the sense that if she questions and ultimately comes up with the answer herself, that's a much deeper faith. We all have to go through those experiences of doubt. We experience them when someone dies at too young of an age. We experience them when we have a personal failure after having put in a great deal of effort. All of those are moments that challenge us and evoke doubt in our mind about God's presence in our life, or even God's goodness. But it's good to have those questions, to work through that uncertainty, and to come out on the other side of it with a deeper sense of connection and a deeper sense of commitment. And so you'll encounter that, and I'm sure you encounter that all the time in your service to youth. Being able to tolerate that, absorb it, be present to it, and allow them to work through it is, I think, a very important part of spiritual maturity. And then finally, there is, unfortunately, instances where we blur boundaries. Of course, the most egregious form of blurring boundaries is when there's a blurring of sexual boundaries, but there are other ways of blurring boundaries that can be problematic. Giving a youth money because they've asked you for money, sometimes doing favors because that's being, again, pulled for strongly, and so on. It takes away something from your role as a mentor, your role as a teacher, your role as guide. And so establishing that clear sense of boundary can sometimes be very, very challenging, and it can be challenged in very subtle ways. The second principle, ethical principle, is the principle of fidelity, to be trustworthy and responsible. It's important that as a servant that we honor our promise and our commitment. That means being consistent, being reliable, being available when we say we're going to be available. And so when you take on the role, and to some extent I'm kind of preaching to the converted because you're all here and you're all committed, but sometimes people think, oh gee, that'd be a good thing to do, to be a servant in the church. They do it for a few weeks or a few months and then they pull away. Well, that can be hugely disappointing, and it can have a tremendous impact on the people that you're meant to serve. Particularly when they bring to that experience any kind of vulnerability. One of the things I do to balance my life is to coach soccer. And one of the groups that we coach in the club that I coach at are children who are developmentally delayed. So these are children that have Down syndrome or have autism and so on. And when we coach them or teach them, we always have to have one-on-one. And so what I would do, because obviously I can't deal with all of them, is I would invite some of the young women from an older team that I coach to help with that. But one of the things that we make very clear to them is, unless you can commit to coming every single week and working with the person that's assigned to you, don't sign up. Because they're going to develop an attachment, and that kind of reliability and consistency is of paramount importance in their experience. And likewise when you assume the role of servant. The third principle is to act with integrity. It's important to avoid setting up false expectations. It's important to honor any plans and promises that we make. So again, when we commit to something, when we make a plan with a youth group, when we make a plan with a Sunday school group, it's very, very important to follow through on that, because again, that consistency is so essential to them when they're such at an influential age. Finally, to respect the dignity and the rights of the individual, to seek, to desire, to understand what the other person's goals are, what their desires are, what their emerging values are, and to gently, again, help to shape those. Not necessarily to convince them to be something, but to help them to arrive at their own clarity in much the same way that we saw depicted in the video. So to avoid undermining the individual's capacity to make their own decision. Sometimes we want people to be kind of mirror images of us. We want a youth, and this happens oftentimes in parenthood, we want them essentially to be a carbon copy of us, or we want them to take on something that we weren't able to achieve in our own life. In doing that, we constrict their potential, and we negate or we deny their capacity to make their own decisions and to begin to define their own life. We want to inform that life with the right values, but we don't necessarily want to write the script word for word for them. And then finally, it's essential to honor the other's confidentiality, to honor their right to privacy. Sometimes people will come to you and they will share something with you that is perhaps troubling for them, or again causing them to really question some things. In a way, even though Abuna's there, sometimes you end up being the confessor. Now, again, it's important to recognize your boundary. If something is being brought to you that's beyond your expertise or beyond what you know how to manage, you need to direct the youth to Abuna for confession. But sometimes what they are sharing with you, they need to try out on you first, because they know you, they have a closeness with you, they have a trust with you, and eventually that can help them then perhaps approach Abuna and go to confession for repentance. So those are the ethical principles. Oh yes. I wanted to share this quote, or this letter that was written to one of the coaches in our club by a young woman. She's 21 years old, so this is after having been with that coach for a number of years. And what I want you to get from it is to see the kind of impact, the kind of significance that you hold in the role of servant. She says, "Saying thank you would not suffice for all that you've done for me. You've taught me so much through the years, and I couldn't have asked for a better coach and mentor. I can speak for the other girls on the team also when I say that you've influenced and molded us all in the best way possible as we were growing up. Personally, I don't think that I would be the woman that I am today without your guidance. I believe that everybody needs a Coach John in their life, because you affected mine in so many positive ways that there are no words to describe it. I hope that I can continue to make you proud. You always had so much confidence in me and believed I could do it even when I thought I couldn't. You've seen me in my good moments and my not so good moments, and yet you still continued to have faith in me. I truly am grateful for all the hard work and effort you put into the girls and me. I will miss you. I will miss being your student on the field. You are always more than just a coach to me, so thank you so much for everything." Now, that's written by a 21-year-old after, I think, having been with this particular individual for 6 or 7 years. They were there to play soccer. But obviously, from her note, you can see that much more than that happened by the person's example, by the person's presence, by the person's faith and confidence and trust in the individual. What you do is no less than that, and I would suspect in many, many instances much, much more than that. Again, it underscores the importance of understanding, recognizing, and knowing the kind of influence that you have on the people that you serve. I'll stop there. There is another presentation, but I think it's getting late, so I probably will save it for another time. Any questions or comments? Yes. 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 The question is, with the people that we serve, how can we tell them that we're not their friend when, in fact, in some instances, that's what helps the relationship to open? I think the general rule is be friendly but not their friend. So, in other words, we need to approach them with a sense of welcome. We need to approach them with a reasonable sense of acceptance. And what I mean by that, I qualify acceptance because we can't accept everything. And we don't want to accept everything. But it has to be a reasonable level of acceptance of the individual, maybe not necessarily the behavior. Part of, again, assuming this role is being able to be clear about the nature of the boundary that you have with the person that you're serving. So you're not their best friend in the same way that a parent is not their child's best friend. But they listen to them, they encourage them when they need encouragement, when that's appropriate, and then they set limits when limits need to be set, and so on. What counts for a lot in terms of establishing that sense of connection is consistency. Being consistently present, being consistently respectful, and respectable yourself in setting the kind of model or example that you want to set for them. People respond to that. The question is, wouldn't it have been better, or would it have been a problem for the teacher at that point when they were at the car? When the teacher said to him, "I'm not your friend, I'm your teacher," and then said to him, "I can't help you for the next 2 days," or "I'm not available for the next 2 days." Would it be better to have just simply told him, "I can't because of health reasons," so that the boy didn't lose trust or faith in him? You can handle that different ways. I think that could have been a way of handling it. Obviously, Mr. Collins was a very private man, and for him that level of privacy was important. So he has to honor what's important in him as well as a value. But the other thing I think in that situation that you have to think about is, if he were to say that to Kevin, again, this is very relationship specific. It's specific to Kevin and it's specific to Mr. Collins. Would that have been too much of a burden for Kevin? What would the impact be? There's not an easy answer. I don't know. I don't know what his analysis of that is, but in some instances we don't necessarily want to give that level of burden or that level of responsibility to a young person, for them now to then shift their attention to worrying about us as opposed to doing what they need to do. So you could handle it that way. There's nothing wrong with handling it that way, particularly if you have that kind of relationship and if you don't have that strong need for privacy. And in other instances, it may be beyond the person's level of maturity to be able to handle that or negotiate that reasonably. Yes, way at the back. Everybody heard the question? How can you make a decision about when to give praise and when not to give praise? Because in some instances, that's really what the person needs. I think one of the things that came out of the discussion this morning when people were going through the various challenges that were discussed in their groups is, one group said, you need to have a relationship or an understanding of the child's family that you're working with in order to really fully be able to respond to what that child needs. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Children or youth are not made from cookie cutters. They're not all the same. So you're very accurate in what you're saying. For some kids, what they need is the praise. That's important. For other kids, that's not necessarily what they need, it's just what they want. In Kevin's case, we saw that it's not necessarily what he needed. He was getting praise and affirmation and acceptance at home. His father had no issue with him getting a C. So it wasn't about that for him. It wasn't about an absence of praise or an emptiness inside. He wanted Mr. Collins to respect him, and he wanted to get what his friend was getting. He saw what his friend was getting, and somehow that made him feel diminished. So it was about that for him. It wasn't necessarily about what he needed. But in other cases, that kind of encouragement is very much what the individual needs, because they're not getting it anywhere else. They don't recognize anything good about themselves. They don't recognize their own value or their own worth, because that's never been or has been seldom affirmed for them. And in those instances, if you are aware of that, then it's very important to affirm and to help build up the individual's self-esteem. Yes?
Is it true that if the children or students like you, then they will rise to your expectations or to the expectations that you have of them? So it's more focused on liking you as a servant or liking you as a teacher and making that connection, then they'll work for you or they'll want to please you.
That's true in many contexts, certainly in the servant context, in the classroom, in many contexts. I think what we have to be careful with there, the question is, you know, if the kids like you, is it true that that will serve as a source of motivation, that they'll want to rise to the occasion? You want them to like you for the right reasons, or you want them to like the right things about you. You know, somebody can get up in front of a class of servants, a Sunday school class, and be very, very funny and very entertaining and very engaging. They may not necessarily always be consistent. They may not necessarily have a depth of spirituality, but the kids love them. Will that necessarily take them where they need to go spiritually? It may or it may not. And so when we talk about liking, I think we need to have some sense of what is it that they're drawn to in me, and are they being drawn to the right things? You know, do they like me because I wear the right clothes? You know, I look cool, I'm hip, I look like them, I don't look like their parents. Do they like me because I like the same music and I can talk about, you know, this music video or that music video? Do they like me because I can use the same vernacular or the same slang that they use and I understand the lingo? All of those may be ways of engaging, and they may evoke a sense of admiration or a sense of attraction, but they're not necessarily deep. They don't have depth to them. They may not be sustainable. And so we need to, again, we need to know who we are as servants and to present our best self to the people that we're serving, with the hope that that's what they'll be drawn to, with the hope and the trust that that substance is in itself a place of connection, because that's where we want to connect with them. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm just thinking of it as a hook to, especially for the young servants who can connect with them because of the clothes, the lingo.
Yeah. You know, the hook, and we talked a little bit about this in the group that I was in this morning. I think the hook, the more important hook, I mean, the language and the clothes and all of that, yes, that has some significance to kids. And that's just the reality of it. So if that's a necessary component to add to what you do, then that's fine. But the greater hook is to make sure that the message that you're giving and the lesson that you're teaching has some significance to their life. You know, when we're talking about things that are very far removed from their life, things that are beyond necessarily what they're able to relate to, then we tend to lose them. We need to be able to take the message and make it relevant for them somehow. That's important. You know, and when one of the things, this might not be a popular statement, but I'll make it anyways, because I heard it from another priest and it made a lot of sense to me. You know, one of the things that he says is that, he said in this talk that he gave is, when you think about the life of Jesus, when you think about all of the things that Jesus did, Jesus was a rebel. He wasn't an easy guy to be around for the people that were there. And we have trouble with the kids because they're rebellious. Well, he was very rebellious. And his message was a message of rebellion. His message was a message of subjugating what was going on with the Romans and what was going on with the traditional Jewish teachings. And so there's something about rebelliousness that isn't necessarily bad. Yes?
If I have my child, or even in the church as a servant, is the child a talented child? So it's easy for me to to believe in him and give him this message. But if the child is a challenged child for me, how can I believe in him, and how can I give him this message if for me I don't believe in him? He can be good.
Yeah. Okay. Did everybody? Oh, sorry. Let me just answer to that. Did everybody hear that? Okay, so when you have a child that is in your group that is talented, it's very easy to believe in them, easy to engage in them. There's a few things out that. One is, a lot of times when we encounter somebody who's particularly challenging, it's because we see something of ourselves in that, something that we don't like about ourselves. And what makes it particularly challenging is it's a part of ourselves that we deny, a part of ourselves that we'd rather not have, that we want to just reject. So that's one possibility. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. This is especially the case in marriages. When you get into a big fight with your wife or your husband, a lot of times the things that annoy you about them in terms of behaviors, attitudes, reflect something of what's deep inside of you. So it's important to engage in that self-examination and to see if that's part of what's going on. Another thing, though, that I would suggest is what I said early on about perfection. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. There is something that each of us brings to the collective reality. So just because that child isn't talented and is challenging us in ways that the other kids don't, there is still something, a uniqueness about them that they bring that has some value. It may not be obvious to you, but it has some value in terms of what it teaches us, even if it's at the level of what it teaches us about ourselves. I need to learn to be more patient. I need to learn to be more empathic. I need to learn to be more creative. So whatever challenge he's presenting me with alerts me to something in myself perhaps that I need to develop further. That's a gift. That's a gift that God has given you through that challenging child. Now, in the moment when you're trying to control the class, that's not always obvious. And you don't necessarily have to engage in that level of analysis and that level of thinking right then, because your primary responsibility is to have some control over the class and to teach the other children. But in reflection, I think that's what it invites us to do. That's what it calls us to do, is what is it that God, how is it that God is speaking to me through that behavior, through that child? What is it that, where is God trying to draw my attention? Because everything that we encounter, I believe, everything that we encounter in our life has some communication value with respect to what it is that God is calling us to do, and what it is that God is calling our attention to. Even the stuff that is most annoying. Okay, so we stop there. Okay, thank you very much.
We thank Dr. Sam for this valuable lecture.
One of the servants, Mona Youssef, and we want to ask her about pretty well the service and the convention, the retreat, the service that you've attended. What is your impression of this wonderful retreat?
It was a wonderful retreat for us as servants, and we've been taught a lot from Amba Mina, Sayyidina Amba Mina, and Dr. Sam, and Father Athanasius Iskandar, and with still more to come, so we need to learn. So convention was amazing, taught us about everything about service related to the whom we serve, students, how to deal with them. So it was a really very good experience for us, and if you ask me, do you want to repeat it again? So yes, for sure. So because it's gonna come back to, I'm gonna take my experience to my place, to my church. So it was amazing. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think you answered the second question, which was really, what do you feel personally that you've gained? So if you were to walk away from here saying, I learned this particular situation, what do you think that would be?
So for example, Sayyidina Amba Mina taught us about the spiritual building for the servant. So he drew our attention to a servant should repent, for example. So a servant should have his own personal spiritual life. We never ever think about this. So just to serve as a duties, not as a spiritual duties. Dr. Sam, for example, taught us about psychology of the servants, potential goals, and how to reach it. So it's all about dealing with kids psychologically, try to deal with lots of problems and how to fill their needs. So it was amazing. If I talk about what we learned, I'm not going to finish today. And Father Athanasius taught us about how the servant will be a role model and how to, your behavior will be affected others when you have partiality in your life. So I don't think that servants thought about it. Outside with the personality and inside the church with another personality. So our Lord Jesus Christ taught us that no partiality in Christianity. So this is Father Athanasius and I'm looking for another أبونا بشوي سلامة today.
أنا معايا نيفين صادق من كنيسة
هاملتون.
قولي لي بقى يا نيفين، عايزة أعرف إيه رأيك في المؤتمر ده اللي حصل وإيه اللي انتي استفدتي منه؟
احنا نشكر ربنا، مبسوطين خالص. المؤتمر الاول للخدام مع نيافة الانبا مينا او الاسقف لينا في كندا، فرحانين بوجوده في وسطينا، وده فعلا اول مؤتمر للخدام وكلنا فرحانين لاننا كلنا مع بعض. دي اول حاجة. والحاجة التانية المهمة جدا ان استفدنا كلنا من تبادل الخبرات. يعني اللي بيدرس بيخدم مع الكبار واللي بيخدم مع الصغيرين. الحقيقة كانت خبرات كتيرة قوي قوي لكل الخدام الأفاضل، وكلنا فرحنا جدا باللقاء ده.
احنا معانا النهارده ابونا يوحنا من كنيسة العذراء، كنيسة الفيلوباتير في جوالف. وطبعا ابونا نرحب بيك يا ابونا.
اهلا وسهلا.
واحنا عارفين ان قدسك يعني ليك الفكره الاولى في هذا المؤتمر، فممكن تقول لنا.
صحح لك المعلومه.
اتفضل.
الفكره فكره نيافه الحبر الجليل الانبا مينا، وكانوا اختاروا 4 اباء كهنه: قدس ابونا اثناسيوس اسكندر كنيسه العذراء في كيتشنر، وقدس ابونا متياس ابراهيم كنيسه ماريمينا في هاملتون، وقدس أبونا يؤنس عوض الله كنيسة الأنبا بولا في لندن. كانت مجموعة من 4 مسؤولين عن الريتريت بتاع السيرفنتس اللي هو بتاع كل الأبروشية اللي بيتعمل مرة كل سنة. فهم يعني من اتضاعهم حطوني في الصورة بحيث ان انا يعني اتابع مع الاباء الكهنة مع كل الكنائس الترتيبات بتاعة المؤتمر.
طب شكرا يا ابونا. انت ايه الانطباع بتاعك بالنسبه للمؤتمر؟ يعني حاسس ان هو مثلا وصل للهدف بتاعه؟
يعني على حسب الفيدباكس اللي جايه لي حاسس الناس كلها مبسوطه من المؤتمر ومبسوطين من المحاضرات اللي اتقالت فيها السيشنز اللي نيافة الانبا مينا قال لنا الافتتاحيه، ودكتور سامويل ميخائيل عمل لنا محاضرة، يعني الناس كلها كانت مبسوطة منه قوي. وقدس أبونا أثناسيوس برضه كان عمل لنا محاضرة جميلة جدا عن when servants offend، فكانت حاجة حلوة. وأعتقد يعني يمكن أنا كنت بتكلم بعد كلمة نيافة الأنبا مينا وقلت بقول له يا سيدنا يعني هكون متجاسر إذا قلت إن الأغلبية اتغيروا النهارده.
طب دي حاجة جميلة وفعلا ده إحساسي أنا كمان. في الحقيقة أستاذ أبونا عايزين نعرف هل المؤتمر ده هيتكرر تاني ومثلا بنفس الطريقة أو في أماكن تانية، أو إيه هدف المجموعة اللي كونت الفكرة دي؟
طبعا احنا عملنا سيرفي وكانوا شايف ان الناس حابين المكان وحابين نوعية المحاضرات والاكتيفيتيز وكله، فلسه بقى بالتشاور مع الاباء علشان نشوف الترتيبات بالنسبة للمؤتمر للعام القادم. طبعا ده مؤتمر سنوي بالنسبة لكل الأبروشية، وفي كمان أنا قلت لهم على في حسب تنبيهات نيافة الحبر الجليل الأنبا مينا إن يبقى في 4 أيام روحية للخدام في مستوى مسيساجا، بس ده لوكال، هيبقى لوكال كل 3 شهور مرة، وده هيتعمل بالتناوب مع كل الكنائس. هيبقى يوم روحي، يعني هيبقى بالنسبة لهنا، بالنسبة لمسيساجا وغربها، هيبقى في يوم روحي للخدام مرة كل 3 شهور. ودي هتبقى بالتناوب. بالنسبة للريتريت السنوي ده كل سنة، يعني ده كل سنة مقام خلاص يعني. بس لسه برضه بنشوف التوقيت، هل التوقيت ده مناسب ولا لا. برضه هنرجع للكوميتي، وبحيث وبالتوافق طبعا مع نيافة الأنبا علشان نعرف الميعاد المناسب.
شكرا يا أبانا، وإحنا فعلا قضينا وقت جميل جدا في المحاضرات وفي المؤتمر ده، ونطلب صلواتك من أجل هذا العمل ومن أجل العمل بتاع الخدام والكنائس كلها، وربنا يديم كهنوتك لينا، ويعني يجعل دايما صلاتك مسموعة من أجلنا.
ربنا يخليك. احنا بنشكر كل الخدام اللي جم، وكل اللي ما جوش برضه اللي ظروفهم ما سمحتش انهم يجي. وانا اعتقد ان الفيدباك اللي هيوصل لهم هيشجعهم، وانا متوقع ان المؤتمرات اللي جاي هتكون اعداد اكتر واكتر. احنا يهمنا مش العدد، لكن يهمنا ان الناس تستفيد. انا يهمني ان الناس تيجي وتستفيد من المؤتمر وتطلع خدت فايدة روحية لشغلهم ولعملهم والأهمية الخدمة. وطبعا بنشكر نيافة الحبر الجليل الأنبا مينا صاحب الفكرة ومجمعنا كلنا، وده أول مرة يحصل يعني مؤتمر للخدام على مستوى الإبروشية كلها. طبعا في كندا من ساعة ما جه نيافة الأنبا مينا وهو بمحبته مجمعنا وباتضاعه بيدينا نموذج حلو قوي. ربنا يخليه لينا.
شكرا يا بان.
المؤتمر أول حاجة المكان لما جيت كان very very beautiful. يعني I was astonished how beautiful it is, how the atmosphere was very welcoming, loving. من أول مرة اتكلمت مع اللي جنبي أنا حسيت إن احنا نعرف بعض من زمان. استفدت جدا من المحاضرين. المكان جميل يعني very positive experience. صعب to believe إن هي first experience يعني إن يكون في مؤتمر في الخدمة. في رأيي إنه شيء ضروري جدا للخدام. we need to connect علشان نعرف خبرات بعض واللي challenges اللي فيس الخادم عموما يعني.
عظيم. طب يعني إذا إيه رأيك في المحاضرات نفسها والكونتنت بتاع المحاضرة؟ يعني حسيتي إنه المحاضرات دي هل هي مفيدة هتقدري تستعمليها وتخدمي بيها؟
Absolutely. أنا في رأيي كل محاضرة منهم تعتبر منهج ليا كخادم. وبالنسبة لي أنا يعني I concluded some points من كل محاضرة، ودي هتبقى بالنسبة لي كل point فيهم هتبقى جول. محاضرة الأنبا مينا in particular وضحت قدامي المحاور الرئيسية لبناء شخصية الخادم. وفهمت إن الخادم لازم تكون شخصيته comprehensive من الناحية الروحية، من ناحية النوليدج والمعلومات، من الناحية النفسية. لازم يراقب نفسه لأن إحنا ambassadors to Jesus. برضو من ضمن التشالنجز اللي اتناقشنا فيها في الوركشوب مع أبونا أثناسيوس فتحت عيني على حاجات كتير. أنا لسه جديدة مبتدية على التشالنجز اللي ممكن تقابل الخادم والخدمة نفسها، وزي إن إحنا we have to impress only one audience اللي هو Jesus Christ. دي بالنسبة لي بتخليني يعني check myself. المحاضرة دي قالت إيه عن يسوع؟ هل هتخلي people I serve love Jesus more ولا لأ؟ تاني محاضرة كانت الدكتور سام برضو الجولز أو إيه دوري أنا كخادم. اكتشفت برضو إن الخادم ده بيبقى teacher, mentor, كاتم أسرار، counselor. وضح برضو إني sometimes البرسون بيجي الأول discuss البروبلم مع الخادم قبل الاعتراف. دي حاجة أنا ما كنتش أتوقعها، حسستني قد إيه بالمسؤولية بتاعة الخادم.
يا ترى يا ميري انطباعك أو يعني اللي حساه بالنسبة للمؤتمر ده أو المؤتمر للسيرفنتس؟
يعني أنا يعني فرحتي بيه كبيرة جدا، لأن ما كنتش متوقعة إن هو يعني هيبقى أورجنايز بالشكل ده والكلام فيه غني جدا. يعني أنا كنت محتاجاه، يعني إحنا كخدام كنا محتاجين مؤتمر زي ده من زمان. أنا أيمزد المؤتمرات دي من أيام ما أنا كنت في مصر، لأن إحنا كنا بنطلع مؤتمرات مع أسقفية الشباب ومع مؤتمرات الخدمة بتاعتنا. فحاسة إن أنا يعني رجعت للزمن القديم بتاعنا، ورجعت للأيام اللي إحنا فعلا مفتقدينها يعني. فسيدنا فعلا مع الآباء الكهنة اللي حضروا معايا، لا يعني طالع بشكل فعلا فعلا ممتاز يعني وجميل يعني. كلامه كله مس قلوبنا قبل ما يبقى يعني كلام إداري أو كلام عن نظام الخدمة. لكن مس فعلا احتياجاتنا كخدام روحيا. حاسين ان احنا كنا فعلا محتاجين ان احنا نبقى خدام بالشكل ده، ان احنا نبقى خدام spiritual in the beginning، وبعد كده اي حاجه ممكن تيجي. يعني ان احنا نعمل اداريات في الخدمه، ان احنا ننظم امورنا، ان احنا نهتم برحلات، نهتم بكذا. لكن اهم حاجه ان انا اهتم بروحياتي كخادم، وتاني حاجه بعد كده طبعا بعلاقتي بالمخدوم او اي حاجه بعد كده ممكن تيجي. بس دي اللي هي البرايورتي بتاعتي، ان انا ابقى روحيا كخادم، ان انا ممتلئ، وان انا تائب ريبنتنس، وان انا ليا باعتراف، وان انا يعني كلمه سيدنا الانبا مينا الصراحه كانت فعلا فعلا عميقه جدا، وانا حسيت بيها ان انا فعلا كنت محتاجاها كخادمه.
طبعا بالاباء الكهنه والسبيكرز اللي كان في المؤتمر، الواحد اتعلم منهم حاجات كتير how to solve these problems، خصوصا بالنسبه للفاميلي problems. if they have مثلا a teenager disabled أو من اللي هم الهانديكاب، how the church can accommodate with this problem.
يا ترى تسوني سلوى، ايه الانطباع بتاعك عن اول مؤتمر يحصل للخدام؟
الحقيقة احنا استفدنا كتير قوي قوي من كل حاجة. يعني اولا في وقت حلو للصلاة، قداسات، صلينا صلاة الأجبية معظمها يعني، تسبيحة، غير بقى المحاضرات اللي هي كانت يعني مركزة على الخادم نفسه. اتعلمنا حاجات كتير قوي، وفي المناقشات بتاعتنا لأن كان في workshops وكان في discussion بيننا ما بين بعض. وطبعا وجود سيدنا الأنبا مينا كان مفرحنا جدا جدا، ووجود الآباء في وسطينا. خدنا خبرات خدام كتير. البروشية الحقيقة فيها يعني خبرات كبيرة مع الخدام يعني، فكان في فرصة حلوة لتبادل الخبرات بيننا ما بين بعض يعني، وإن احنا نبقى بروح واحدة في المؤتمر ده. نشكر ربنا.